For more than 40 years, two nations have stood on opposite sides of one of the most dangerous rivalries in modern history. On one side, the global superpower, the United States. On the other, a revolutionary state determined to resist foreign influence, Iran. Their confrontation has shaped wars, alliances, and the fragile balance of power across the Middle East. But this conflict did not begin with missiles, sanctions, or nuclear tensions. It began decades earlier with a secret operation, a collapsing monarchy, and a revolution that would change the course of history. To understand why the United States and Iran became enemies, we must return to the moment when everything began to unravel. At the beginning of the 20th century, Iran stood at a crossroads between ancient civilization and a rapidly changing modern world. For thousands of years, empires had risen and fallen across this land. But beneath Iran's deserts and mountains lay something that would transform its future: vast reserves of oil. By the mid-1900s, oil had become one of the most powerful resources on Earth. Nations rose to dominance through energy, industry, and control of resources. And Iran possessed one of the largest oil reserves in the world. Yet for many Iranians, that wealth did not belong to them. For decades, the country's oil industry had been dominated by the powerful Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, a foreign enterprise that controlled production and profits. While enormous revenues flowed abroad, many Iranians felt their nation was being denied its own prosperity. Anger and frustration began to grow. In the early 1950s, a new political figure emerged at the center of this movement: Mohammad Mossadegh. A passionate nationalist and skilled politician, Mossadegh believed Iran's resources should belong to its own people. When he became prime minister in 1951, he made a bold and historic decision: Iran's oil industry would be nationalized. The announcement electrified the nation. Crowds filled the streets in celebration, praising Mossadegh as a defender of independence and national dignity. But beyond Iran's borders, the reaction was very different. Western governments feared that losing control of Iranian oil could reshape the balance of power during the tense years of the Cold War. Watching the crisis unfold was Iran's young monarch, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, known as the Shah. His position was increasingly fragile, caught between rising nationalist pressure at home and powerful foreign interests abroad. What had begun as a dispute over oil was quickly evolving into something far more dangerous: a struggle over power, sovereignty, and the future of Iran itself. And soon, that struggle would trigger one of the most controversial operations in modern history. By 1953, the political crisis inside Iran was reaching a dangerous breaking point. Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh remained widely admired by many Iranians. To his supporters, he was the man who had dared to reclaim the nation's oil and defend its independence. But beyond Iran's borders, the situation looked very different. The nationalization of oil had struck directly at the interests of the powerful Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, and leaders in the United Kingdom were determined to reverse it. At the same time, officials in the United States were increasingly worried that political instability in Iran could open the door to Soviet influence during the tense years of the Cold War. Behind closed doors, intelligence agencies began to consider a drastic solution. A covert plan was set in motion, one that would soon reshape the future of Iran. History would later remember it as the 1953 Iranian coup d'état. In August 1953, a carefully orchestrated campaign began unfolding in the streets of Tehran. Newspapers carried inflammatory stories. Radio broadcasts spread rumors and propaganda. Demonstrations erupted across the city as rival political groups clashed. Day by day, the atmosphere grew more chaotic. Then the decisive moment arrived. Military units loyal to the Shah moved against Mossadegh's government. Within days, the prime minister was removed from power. The young monarch, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, who had briefly fled during the turmoil, returned to Tehran and reclaimed control of the country. To many Western officials, the operation was considered a strategic victory. But for millions of Iranians, the events of 1953 told a very different story, a moment when foreign powers had intervened in their nation's political destiny. The memory of that intervention would not disappear. Instead, it would linger for decades, quietly shaping the anger and distrust that would one day explode into revolution. In the aftermath of the dramatic events of 1953, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi emerged as the unchallenged ruler of Iran. With the crisis behind him, the Shah began to pursue an ambitious vision. Supported by powerful Western allies, particularly the United States, he sought to transform Iran into a modern and influential nation in the Middle East. Oil wealth poured into the country. New highways stretched across the landscape. Factories rose in expanding cities. Universities grew, industries developed, and Iran began to modernize at a remarkable pace. To many observers around the world, it appeared that Iran was entering a new era of prosperity and progress. In the 1960s, the Shah launched a sweeping program of reforms known as the White Revolution. The initiative aimed to reshape Iranian society. Land reforms redistributed property, education expanded rapidly, and new efforts were made to modernize agriculture and industry. But beneath the surface of this transformation, a different reality was unfolding. Many traditional religious leaders believed that the rapid modernization was eroding Iran's cultural and religious identity. At the same time, political opposition was increasingly suppressed. The Shah's security forces worked relentlessly to silence dissent, creating an atmosphere of fear that spread across the country. Among the most outspoken critics of the regime was a cleric named Ruhollah Khomeini. From his sermons and speeches, he condemned the Shah's policies and his close alignment with Western powers. By the 1970s, dissatisfaction with the monarchy was spreading throughout Iranian society, among religious leaders, intellectuals, students, and workers alike. The country appeared stable on the surface, but quietly, beneath the weight of modernization and repression, the forces of revolution were beginning to gather. By the late 1970s, the political order in Iran was beginning to crack. Years of economic inequality, political repression, and deep cultural tension had created a volatile atmosphere. Across the country, frustration was turning into open resistance. At first, the protests were small. Students gathered in universities. Religious leaders spoke out in mosques. Workers began organizing strikes in key industries. But slowly, the demonstrations began to grow. City after city saw crowds filling the streets. What had started as scattered protests soon transformed into a nationwide movement demanding the end of the Shah's rule. Groups that once had little in common, religious leaders, intellectuals, students, and industrial workers, now found themselves united by a single goal: the fall of the monarchy. At the center of this growing revolution stood the exiled cleric Ruhollah Khomeini. From exile, Khomeini continued to denounce the regime of Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, accusing the Shah of corruption and condemning his close alliance with the United States. His speeches were secretly recorded, copied onto cassette tapes, and distributed throughout Iran, spreading his message from city to city, inspiring a growing wave of resistance. By early 1979, the pressure on the government had become overwhelming. Mass demonstrations flooded the streets. Strikes paralyzed key sectors of the economy. Government authority began to collapse. Then, in January 1979, the unthinkable happened. The Shah fled the country. Within weeks, Ruhollah Khomeini returned to Iran to a massive public welcome. The monarchy that had ruled for decades was gone. In its place, a new political system emerged, the Islamic Republic. For many Iranians, the revolution represented a historic victory against authoritarian rule and foreign influence. But the revolution also marked the beginning of something far more dangerous: a new and deeply hostile relationship between Iran and the United States, a rivalry that would soon erupt into one of the most dramatic international crises of the 20th century. In November 1979, the fragile relationship between Iran and the United States collapsed in a moment that stunned the world. The revolution had overthrown the Shah, but the fear of foreign interference had not disappeared. Many in Iran believed that Washington might still try to restore the monarchy. Those fears intensified when the exiled ruler, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, was allowed to enter the United States for medical treatment. To American officials, it was a humanitarian decision. But to many Iranian revolutionaries, it confirmed their deepest suspicions. Then, on November 4th, everything changed. A group of militant students stormed the American embassy in Tehran. Within hours, dozens of diplomats and staff were taken hostage. The images spread rapidly across the world. A superpower, humiliated. A revolution, defiant. What followed was one of the most dramatic standoffs of the 20th century. For 444 days, The hostages remained in captivity as the crisis dominated global headlines. Inside the White House, President Jimmy Carter faced intense pressure to bring them home. Negotiations dragged on. Tensions escalated. The world watched, waiting for a resolution. For Iran's revolutionary leadership, the embassy takeover became a powerful symbol of resistance against foreign influence. For the United States, it was a moment of national humiliation. When the hostages were finally released in January 1981, the damage had already been done. The conflict between Iran and the United States was no longer just political. It had become deeply personal and far more dangerous. And from that moment on, the rivalry would no longer be confined to diplomacy. It would begin to spread across an entire region. In the years that followed the crisis, the confrontation between Iran and the United States began to move beyond embassies and diplomacy. It was no longer just a political dispute. It was becoming a regional struggle, one that would reshape the balance of power across the Middle East. Iran's new leadership sought to extend its influence beyond its borders, supporting allied movements and groups that shared its vision and ideology. At the same time, the United States moved to contain that influence, strengthening its alliances and deepening its presence across the region. Among its closest partners was Israel, a nation that viewed Iran as one of its most serious strategic threats. But this was not a war fought with direct confrontation. Instead, it unfolded in the shadows. Across different countries and conflicts, both sides supported opposing forces, a pattern that would come to define what are known as proxy wars. Battles were fought indirectly. Influence was expanded quietly. Power was contested without open declarations of war. And as this shadow conflict spread, instability followed. Tensions simmered beneath the surface, through sanctions, covert operations, and occasional flashes of violence. Yet despite decades of hostility, neither side crossed the line into full-scale war. Instead, the rivalry evolved into something more complex, a long-term strategic struggle shaping alliances, security decisions, and the future of one of the most volatile regions on Earth. And as the years passed, this silent conflict would begin to enter a new and even more dangerous phase.